The case we're going to talk about in this video is possibly the most repulsive on the channel. It's filled with real footage that is not suitable for the faint-hearted. However, that's not what makes it shocking. So, what does? You'll find out from the video. On June 13, 1981, a man of short stature, of Asian appearance, called a taxi to the 10th house on Erlanger Street in Paris. He had two large suitcases, each weighing at least 20 kilograms. The arriving taxi driver helped the mysterious man load the suitcases into the car. Seeing them, the taxi driver was sure that the man must be heading either to the train station or the airport. Contrary to his assumption, the man asked to be taken to the largest park in Paris, the Bois de Boulogne. The journey took at least half an hour. Upon reaching the park, the man got out of the taxi, took one suitcase, and headed deeper into the park. It was evident at a glance that it was clearly difficult for him to drag them. In the park, the man reached the nearest lake. There, he placed the suitcases on the ground and, contemplating, moved away from them a short distance. After a minute, a passerby called out to him. He showed us the suitcases and asked, "Are these yours?" To which the man, after a moment's thought, replied, "No." The passerby approached the suitcases. Examining them closely, he shouted because, upon detailed inspection, large bloodstains were visible on each of the suitcases. A crowd of curious people gathered around the suitcases, and the mysterious man who brought them to the lake had by then disappeared. Minutes later, the police arrived at the park. Opening the suitcases, the police found in each of them parts of a human body. It was unclear at this stage whether these were parts of the same person's body or the bodies of different people. The horror of the discovery was heightened by the fact that the skin had been removed from some parts of the body, and in some places, even the flesh. On the same day, an examination of the discovered body parts was conducted. Inside the suitcases, a head was found, but the face on it was so disfigured that identifying the victim was barely possible. Nevertheless, the head provided an answer to at least one question. The found victim had a gunshot wound to the head. This was highly likely the cause of death. Soon, experts determined that all the body parts found in the suitcases belonged to one and the same person. It was also established that it was a young woman, 20 to 25 years old. But that was it. The found body parts could not provide any other answers. Now the main task was to find the mysterious man who brought two suitcases to the park. Fortunately for the police, this man had a rather noticeable appearance. He was a man about 1.5 meters tall, of Asian descent. Although he came to the park closer to nightfall, there were still many people who noticed the small man with two huge suitcases. Searches for this person were printed in newspapers, and soon the police found the taxi driver who brought the man to the park. He recounted that he picked up a man matching the description from Erlanger Street. Thus, approximately 48 hours after the discovery of the suitcases, the police arrested the main suspect in this case. A man who lived in the 10th house on Erlanger Street. A Japanese man named Issei Sagawa. Issei Sagawa was a 32-year-old student at the prestigious Sorbonne University in Paris. He came from a wealthy, respected family in Japan. Initially, this intelligent, educated man seemed an unlikely candidate to commit such a heinous crime. However, when the police searched his apartment, all doubts were dispelled. "I've conducted many searches, but this was the most horrifying for me," said a police officer who conducted the search at Sagawa's place. In Sagawa's refrigerator, pieces of human flesh were found. On the table were plates with human remains. The meat was fried in sauce, and next to it was a plate of garnish. Seeing this, the police made a horrible but obvious conclusion. The arrested Issei Sagawa was a cannibal. Issei Sagawa was born in Tokyo in 1949. These were the years after World War II, and Japan was in decline. But Sagawa was lucky. He was born into a favorable, wealthy family. His grandfather owned a popular newspaper in Japan, and his father was the president of a large company. From a young age, Sagawa stood out due to his small stature and frail build. His parents attributed it to his being born premature and nearly dying at birth. In any case, this physique made Sagawa very shy in interacting with classmates, especially girls. Strange desires began to manifest in him even during his school years. Sagawa wanted to taste every girl he found attractive. He didn't share these strange desires with anyone. Later, around the age of 20, his fantasies shifted towards girls of European descent. At that time, there was a trend in Japan for models of that particular type. The collective image of a tall blonde with classic European features captivated Sagawa's mind. He admired such girls. Around the same time, a young German woman moved to the neighborhood where Sagawa lived. She looked exactly like the girl in Sagawa's dreams. Seeing her on the street, Sagawa took this encounter as a sign. He could no longer restrain himself. He needed to taste this girl. One night in 1972, Sagawa broke into the room of this young woman. He was armed with a knife, not intending to kill her. He only wanted to taste a piece of her thigh. However, Sagawa was not very cautious. Accidentally waking her as he approached, the girl screamed. Sagawa attempted to escape, but the girl proved stronger. She prevented him from doing anything, and the arriving police arrested Sagawa. He was charged with attempted rape. No one suspected his true motive at the time. Later, Sagawa's father compensated the girl financially, and she withdrew the charges against Sagawa, allowing him to avoid prison. After this incident, Sagawa's father sent him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist concluded that Sagawa could be dangerous to society, but this remained just a piece of paper. Then, 5 years later, Sagawa left Japan, and in 1977, he flew to study in France. The next 4 years spent in France, Sagawa struggled with the temptations that were so distant from him in Japan. The thought of tasting the flesh of a beautiful, young girl never left him. Sometimes he hired prostitutes, but each time they seemed too dirty for this purpose. Then, in 1981, a fateful meeting occurred for Sagawa. That year, a 25-year-old German student named Renée Hartevelt transferred to his class. She made an instant impression on Sagawa. He was completely enchanted by her beauty, her light hair, and the white skin of her hands. On the first day he saw Renée, Sagawa drew her portrait. He often looked at it during breaks between classes. To his surprise, on the day of their first meeting, Renée tried to talk to him. Later, she invited him and a couple of other students to dinner at a restaurant. This allowed Sagawa to get a little closer to Renée. Over time, they became friends. Sagawa was attracted to her apparent intelligence and her ability to discuss everything, from Leonardo da Vinci's paintings to European literature. Sagawa invited Renée to concerts, and she sometimes invited him over for tea. Once they even danced together. This allowed Sagawa to physically get closer to her. Renée spoke 3 languages, and Sagawa asked her to teach him German. Since his father was very wealthy, Sagawa generously paid Renée for her lessons. One day, Sagawa invited Renée to dinner at his home. He asked her to read a poem by his favorite German poet. She did. After she left, he smelled the place where she had sat. At that moment, he vowed to possess her forever. Soon he asked her to come to dinner again. He had a cassette recorder, and he wanted to record her reading poems. Renée agreed to the evening of June 11, 1981. Sagawa prepared to bring his last fantasy to life. Upon arriving in Paris, he bought a .22 caliber rifle for self-defense. Everything was ready when Renee arrived. He sat her on the floor in a Japanese style to drink tea. He added a little rum to her drink to make her more compliant. They chatted a bit while Sagawa waited for the rum to take effect. Then he told Renee that he loved her, to which she replied that she was only ready to be friends. Sagawa nodded. Then he gave Renee the collection of poems, and she sat on a chair. While Renee read the poem in her native language, Sagawa approached her from behind with a rifle. He fired a bullet into the back of her head, and she fell from the chair. He was surprised by the amount of blood flowing from her wound. Then he fainted. Upon regaining consciousness, he undressed Renee's body. It was difficult for him to remove the clothes, but at the same time, he was pleased that she could no longer refuse his advances. She belonged to him. Cutting into her, Sagawa was surprised not to see red meat but only fat. To find the flesh, he had to make a deeper cut. For him, the flesh was delightfully tasty. He looked into Renee's lifeless eyes and said to her, "Je t'aime," expressing love in French. Using an electric carving knife, Sagawa began to cut Renee into pieces. He laid out strips of meat to preserve them for later, taking a few raw pieces to taste. Then he quickly prepared fried human flesh with mustard. While cooking and eating her remains, he listened to the recording made while Renee read the poem. He photographed the mutilated corpse and violated it. After finishing, he went to sleep. He knew he would have to figure out how to dispose of the evidence in the morning. The next day, finding that the body still did not smell, he continued to taste its parts. In particular, the hand that had captivated him. After a while, flies began to gather around the body. At that moment, Sagawa realized that his honeymoon with Renee was over. The body had to be disposed of. Using an axe, Sagawa chopped the body into pieces. He placed them in 2 suitcases he had bought specifically for this purpose. On June 13, 1981, 2 days after the murder, Sagawa called a taxi to his apartment. He planned to take the suitcases to the Bois de Boulogne and throw them into the lake. However, to his surprise, the park, despite the late hour, was still crowded. He struggled to drag the suitcases to the lake. There he stopped and, contemplating what to do next, stepped away from the suitcases. After a minute, a passerby, pointing to the suitcases, asked, "Are these yours?" Sagawa hesitated. Although he did not complete the act, he could not answer yes. So, after a moment's thought, he replied no and quietly walked deeper into the park. 2 days later, as we already know, he was arrested. Parts of Renee's body were found in his apartment. Everything was evident. There was no point in hiding anything. Therefore, on the day of his arrest, Sagawa confessed to everything. Now he was preparing to face punishment. There were 2 options: life imprisonment or the death penalty. The irony of this story is that Sagawa was never convicted of this heinous crime. Why and how was this possible? After the arrest and obvious evidence, the French court took a long time to schedule a hearing. One after another, psychiatric examinations were assigned to Sagawa. In the end, after 2 years, the French court declared him insane, making it impossible to convict him for this reason. Sagawa was placed in a clinic indefinitely. There, Sagawa did not waste time. In the clinic, he wrote the book In the Fog, which sold almost 500,000 copies. As we already know, Sagawa had wealthy parents, and this also played a role, as he had the best lawyer from the beginning. After a while, the lawyer began to insist that Sagawa be extradited to Japan. In 1985, this eventually happened. Sagawa was sent to Japan. There he was also placed in a clinic near Tokyo. However, as unbelievable as it may sound, he spent less than a year there. He was declared sane, and on August 12, 1986, he was discharged from the clinic. He was not tried in Japan because there were no charges against him here since the case in France was closed due to insanity. The shocked parents of the murdered Rene insisted on opening a case against Sagawa in Japan, but their attempts were thwarted by international bureaucracy. Upon his release, Sagawa became a Japanese celebrity. He became a frequent guest on Japanese TV shows and even hosted a cooking show on Japanese TV. Moreover, he even starred in one of the movies. In addition to this, he wrote books, many of which were popular. He received many letters from Japanese girls offering him marriage. But Sagawa rejected them. He said he preferred European girls, pre-seasoned with spices and fresh vegetables. Sagawa's wave of popularity lasted about 15 years and then began to wane. In his last years, Sagawa lived on welfare, taken care of by his brother. Only recently, about 6 months ago, on November 24, 2022, Sagawa died of pneumonia. Such is the story of Issei Sagawa, a man who killed and ate a young girl and was not punished for it.